Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here today to talk about the basics of canning, mostly for the sake of those who are new to canning, or maybe you're considering pressure canning even though they've been doing the hot water bath method for many years. And I just want to go over some things that you should have on hand and some basic guidelines to follow. First off, let's talk about having a good canning book on hand. Now, if you choose to get the All-American canner like I have, the one great thing about that is, and I don't know about other canners, maybe they do too, is that not only does it come with a book on how to use it, it also has all your basics that you're going to need for times for pressure canning and hot water bath canning, various things in here. And actually this is what I use mostly when I go to refer to times. And then another book I highly recommend getting, if you're able to, is the complete book of Home Preserving by Ball. I rarely use this book, but it's got a lot of great recipes in there. I've never used the recipes, but I'm glad I have this book on hand as just a backup guideline for this other book as well. So I will link to this down below. I will also, if it's available, be linking to my pressure canner, but last I saw that particular one was out of stock on Amazon. I'm not sure where else you can buy it except for maybe directly from the company. Now, speaking of canners, if you're going to do hot water bath canning, that's the cheapest to get started because you can just get one of those big enamelware stock pots. Those big ones will come with a basket that goes inside there. You're going to need something that sits on the bottom of any canner that you use, whether it be a pressure canner or just the hot water bath, because you don't want your jars sitting directly on the bottom of any pan while it's heating up, because that can crack your jars. Now, the hot water bath canners come with a type of basket that has little handles that you can hook over the edges of your pan when you're putting the jars in, and then you lower it down for canning and then pick it back up and hook it over the edge of the pan when you're taking the jars out. Now, one thing about hot water bath canning is, as far as I know, you can't go 2 layers, but I'm always doing bigger jars. Now, possibly you can do 2 layers if you're doing smaller jars. I've just never tried that myself. Now, with my particular canner, this is the second to the biggest size that the All-American has, and I liked this one because I can do 2 rows of quart jars. And so when I'm doing quart jars, I can do 14 quart jars. If I'm doing pint jars, I can do 16 wide mouth, or I can do up to 18 regular mouth. And I rarely can anything smaller than that, but I've done relish in half pint jars. The All-American canner comes with 2 of these if you get this size, and then the next size up you can do 2 layers, but it's wider. So you only want to get the biggest one if you're not going to be doing it in your kitchen, but you have something big enough like an open fire or whatever that you can can over, because it is very big. But there also are smaller sizes. Now, a while back we did a couple different videos on some older All-American canners, older as far as when they were made, but one of them was still brand new, had not been used. The other one looked like it had been used once or twice. We picked up at a garage sale for 20 bucks for 2 of them, and still in the boxes, still with the books they came with. The difference with those, instead of having the weight like mine came with, those had the petcocks on it, which that was the common way to use the All-American for a long time. Then they switched to the weighted method, which I highly recommend. So if you have an older one, or you came across an older one at a garage sale or Facebook Market or wherever it is, and it does have the petcock, you can get yourself a weight and a vent pipe for relatively inexpensive in comparison to having to buy a whole brand new one. And to me, it's just a safer way to go. Now, I'll put the 2 different videos. I'll put the one where I talk about the canners, and then the one where Patrick actually changed out the petcock for the vent. And he also changed out, since they sent us new gauges for those two, we changed those out too. And I'll also put the link down below to where you can find parts for your All-American canner, but you can also find parts for other canners like Presto and whatever else is out there. And so I did buy myself some backup parts as well. It's always good to have backup parts. Now, if you have the kind of canner that requires the rubber seal or gasket inside the lid here, then those are some parts you should stock up on and have extra. One thing I did really like about the All-American canner is that you don't have to worry about that. However, there is still the rubber release valve, emergency release valve here. This is just to, in case your pressure gets too high and you're not keeping an eye on it, this will blow out and release the excess pressure. So this is a good thing to have. It's never happened to me. These are really cheap to get a few extras on hand, and since they are rubber, they can degrade over time. Now, I've been using this for quite a number of years without that being an issue, but I still bought backups just in case. So my personal recommendation, if you can afford it, is get an All-American. It's built like a tank. It's heavy duty. You have several different sizes you can go by, and I love it, but I've never used any other pressure canner, so I can't compare. I'm just going by my own experience. Now, when you have a canner, you can still do hot water bath canning in it. When I do that, I don't put the lid on like that. I just kind of set it if I feel like the lid needs to be on there at all. I actually set it at an angle. I certainly don't tighten it down because I'm just boiling the food. So the difference between hot water bath and pressure canning is hot water bath is pretty much how it sounds. You're just boiling the food, and you need your water level to be at least an inch above your jars when you're doing that, and you're going to boil for a certain amount of time. When you're pressure canning, well, it's being put under pressure. You don't need as much water in the pan, and it's usually going to be for a shorter period of time. But some foods should not be pressure canned or they'll turn to mush, but other foods really should be pressure canned. Yes, for many, many years, people have, long before pressure canners became common and then began to be pushed by certain companies, people hot water bath everything, whether they be low acid foods or high acid foods. And there is actually a chart you can find, and I will link to it, where that was put out by Ball on the times needed to hot water bath things like chili, meats, beans, carrots, anything that's low acid, as well as things that are high acid. So it can be done. And even though I've never done it because I've always used my pressure canner for such things, you can do it. If you can't afford a pressure canner, that was very common for people to hot water bath the low acid foods. It just takes at least twice as long. So the standard time when you're doing a hot water bath on low acid foods is going to be at least 3 hours. Some will take a little bit less, some will take a little bit more. That's just the standard. And I believe that applies to no matter what size jars you're using. But when it comes to pressure canning, it's going to go by the size of the jar, and there is still a standard amount of time that's usually pretty much the same all the way across the board. But I had found out last year that carrots need a lot less time than something like green beans or chili or anything with meat in it for that matter. But the standard time for canning low acid foods is going to be 75 minutes when you're talking pressure canning for pints, and 90 minutes for quarts. Now, if you're doing fish is the one thing that takes more time, and if I remember correctly, it's an hour and 45 minutes for fish, no matter what size the jar. So why that is, I don't know, but I always follow those time guidelines when I come across them. So I'm not sure why I was off on the carrots. I was sure I had checked and read that time, but it could be simply that I had made the assumption that they needed the same amount of time as the beans, where it was really not necessary for me to can them that long. There was no difference in the texture I found between the ones I canned for 75 minutes and the ones I canned for, I think it was 25 minutes pressure canned. The texture was still the same. But if you can get away with going for a shorter amount of time, then that's what you should do, because it will save you energy, whether it be electricity when you're doing it on your stovetop Or if you're like me and you use a propane burner to can with, that's going to save a lot of propane. With high acid foods, like right here, you'll see I have some peaches and some salsa verde. These are high acid foods. These were both done using the water bath method. The times vary quite a bit when you're talking about that. It could be anywhere, especially things like if you're talking things with also a high sugar content like jams, it could be anywhere from 10 minutes to 45 minutes depending on the size of the jar and what it is you're canning. This again is why you need some kind of good guidelines on time frames for specific things. Now let me talk a little bit about recipes. When it comes to making recipes, where it really matters most as far as making sure you have the acidity right for canning is when you're hot water bath canning, because you want to make sure you have the right acidity and or sugar content to be able to use that method. So if you're following specific recipes, that's where that's going to come in handy, whether it be for salsas or pickles or whatever it is that you're making and you're going to hot water bath can. That's where it's going to matter the most. Especially if you're going for like that lower time frame. I believe when it comes to meats and green beans and so on, that's not going to matter. When I'm pressure canning, I don't worry about any specific recipe. I just make what it is I'm going to make the way I normally make it, and then I pressure can it. The one thing I might do just a little bit differently would be to cook an item less than I normally would if I'm going to eat it right away, such as chili or the kidney beans that I canned up right here, just because they're going to cook in the canning process as well. Now we're also all going to have our different preferences on how we can, or whether we're going to raw pack things or cook the things first. Mostly when it comes to fruits and vegetables, and even meats, I almost always raw pack. One thing I don't always do, which is really recommended, is if you're going to can tomatoes, it is a good idea, just plain tomatoes, to cook them down a little bit first, instead of doing like what I normally do is just process them up and put them directly raw into the jar. And the reason for that is that I have found when I do it that way, I'm more apt to end up with a lot of headspace, even when I work hard to get all the bubbles out in my jars of tomatoes, than when I've actually cooked something down a little bit when it comes to tomatoes. Because no matter how much you try to work those air bubbles out, there's always going to be some in there. And so then when you go to can it, you might end up with this much headspace instead of just this much, like I have in the times where I've actually cooked the tomatoes just for a little bit. It doesn't take that long before I can them. But when it comes to the green beans, the carrots, the peaches, I always raw pack. I just put the stuff in there and pack it as is. And potatoes, yes, I find them best personally, even though some people recommend to cook them first. I did that on my first batch of potatoes I canned. Did not like them at all. Raw packing is best for canning diced up potatoes, in my personal opinion and experience. Yes, you'll end up with a little more starch in the jar, but it's not that big a deal. You can just dump it out into a colander and rinse them when you go to use them. The flavor and texture on the potatoes turns out so much better when they are raw packed, and it's easier too than going through all that other process. Now let's talk a little bit about jars and lids. You might have noticed that I have two different types of lids here. I have the standard metal lids that I used on this chili I just canned up the other day. And then I have the Tatler lids. I actually use the Tatler lids far more than I do the metal lids. One reason why is because I invested in these and they're definitely reusable over and over again. But when it comes to canning beans, chili, and meats in general, I usually try to stick with the metal lids, only because I find that when I'm canning chilies, beans by themselves, or meats by themselves, I'm more apt to have failures in my sealing. I'm not sure why that is, so I play it safe in that regards and do the metal lids. However, even metal lids can be reused if they are kept in good condition. So for example, here's a jar right here. Had no problem sealing it. This one, I don't know if you can tell, there's a little bit of writing left here from whatever I had used it for before, and it sealed just great. I had no problems getting this to seal, and I've done this a few times. This here is actually a new lid, but as long as it still looks brand new, other than maybe some writing left on there, is nothing embedded in this part here, or it's not this part isn't all wore out and cracked. There's no dents at all along this edge. Where the sealing part is, that's where it matters. If there's a dent in here, it's not going to matter. If it's a hole, it will matter. But if it's just a little dent in this part here, that's not going to make a difference in the canning. It's whether or not this edge here is damaged at all or has anything embedded in it. Then you should be able to reuse it. Now, I know a lot of people do that, but I also know a lot of people will say, no, you're never supposed to do that. Just use your own judgment when it comes to that. I'm not going to recommend one way or the other. I'm just going to say I've tried it several times reusing lids for canning and have had very good success. I've never had any failures on those particular lids. I haven't done a lot of them, but so far have not had any failures on those. So then let's talk a little bit about the Tatler lids. I love them. I use them for everything else that I can, such as you can see here, the green beans, all my salsas, all my tomatoes, any fruit that I'm canning up like the peaches here. They work great for me, but I tell you, it took me a little bit to figure out the trick on getting the proper tightness of the band. So the difference is when you're using something like a Tatler or a Harvest Guard, both are reusable lids. And I will link to the Tatler company down below, which is where I get mine, is that you have two parts. You have the little rubber seal here, and then you have the lid. Both parts are reusable again and again and again. And you go to put your band on, you don't crank it on as tightly as you would with a metal lid like this before it goes into the canner. There is a specific trick to it to get the right tightness. Sometimes following the directions they give you can seem still too vague. So I will link down below to the video I did showing how to properly tighten the band before you put it in the pressure canner. And then when you pull it out of the pressure canner, you can let it sit for a minute, but not too long. And then you're gonna crank it down tightly like you normally would with the metal lid at that point. You don't want the lid on too tightly when it goes into the canner because you can blow up your jar or just blow the lids off. The method I show in that video is super easy, that it should work every time. I have had no issues with it when I use that. What I don't recommend is buying the off-brand lids. A lot of those are being made in China. A lot of people have been scammed by those lids, thinking they're actually buying ball lids because the packaging on the site will look very much the same, or it will say something like official Mason lids and it's written the same way as ball, and so people really think that's what they're buying. And you got to read those things closely. Those are made in China. They might put an American flag on there, and that's going to make you automatically assume it's made in the US. No, they're not. They're made in China, and they have a lot of failures to them and a lot of other issues. I personally would not trust them, and I don't even know that they work well for vacuum sealing. So don't invest in those. Either get ball lids or Kerr lids, or look into getting the reusable lids. These are going to be reusable far more times than your metal lids when it comes to canning or pressure canning. Of course, they're going to be more expensive, but they're well worth the investment. Now let's come back to how you can as far as your heat source. A lot of places will say not to use the All-American canner or any kind of canner on a glass top stove, but I know many people that do it. But it's also going to depend on the size of your canner. I personally would not, because mine is a double layer, and once it's all filled up, it's a very heavy. And then if you get the bigger one, there's no way that's going to work on your regular stove. At least I don't think so. So I do all my canning on an old turkey fryer burner that we had bought a good number of years ago, fried a couple of turkeys, and that's all we ever used it for. From that point on, that burner has been used for canning, and I do all my canning outside. Even before I started pressure canning, that's just the way I did it, because the propane is going to heat up a lot quicker, and it's outside, especially since a lot of my canning is done in the summertime. That keeps the heat outside as well. And then especially when we moved on to the pressure canning with a much heavier pot that can hold a lot more, definitely was going to do that out there. And I have a video specifically on that setup that I will also link to down below. If you have a regular burner stove, yes, you can without the glass. Most canners should work well on that. So when you're purchasing your canner, if you haven't got one yet, your pressure canner, check the measurements of your the canner you're looking at and the measurements of your stove and whatever. If you have a microwave above your stove or anything above there, what is your headspace there? Do you have enough room to put a canner there? But also, I have actually seen a YouTube video years ago where someone had a glass top stove very much like mine and the same size canner I have, and they were doing their canning on a glass top stove. Most of that is just the companies do not want to be held liable if you break your glass top. And so they've got to put those disclaimers in there anyway. But I would still not do it personally, just because it does make me nervous putting anything too heavy on my glass top. All right, now let's talk just a little bit about storing your jars. I have a video out there on how I store my jars. It's all going to be a matter of choice, your space, and what's going to work best for you. But I will say this, there's this old wives' tale, basically that's what it is, that you should never ever stack your jars. Well, that's just a wives' tale. Actually, there's a, I think it's a government or a National Institute of Home Preservation, I think it is, that actually says, yes, you can stack your jars. You just don't want to go higher than 3 jars high when it comes to stacking. And it's also recommended that you have some kind of layer. It can be cardboard, a thin piece of wood. It can be a box. You can be putting them in boxes and putting the boxes on top of each other. It's just recommended you do that. That's going to give it a little bit of buffer and a little bit of cushion, help displace the weight. Now, if you want to see how I do it, I'll link to that video down below so you can check that out. And then the other thing would be in regards to, like you can see this jar here, leaving the bands on. I believe in that video I also talk about why on some of my jars I don't ever leave the bands on. So the bands come off always to be washed, because that's one of the first things why you don't want to just leave the bands on, especially if you're talking about anything that's got sugar in it that can be sticky. That's still going to leach out a little bit as you're canning and get on the outside. If you just leave these bands on there and don't wash them, they will then adhere like cement to your jars. And then the other thing is, by leaving the bands on tightly, somehow it comes unsealed and you have the band on there tightly, but botulism can get in there because the actual seal has been lost. Then what's going to happen is the lack of oxygen exposure is not going to clue you in that the seal has been broken, because when there's oxygen going in there, you will see mold develop on top. So that's why you can't have your bands on tightly, just in case something like that happens. But you can put the bands on loosely. I've had bands on loosely, and I have reasons for doing that, which I discussed in that video. And as long as the band is on loosely, and again, it's been cleaned and dried thoroughly, that will leave enough opening in there the oxygen can get in and you can see mold growing, so that then you'll know that is a bad jar. With botulism, there's no visible sign, no flavor, and no smell to it, so you wouldn't know if the jar was unsealed whether or not it had botulism in there. And that's why if you find a jar that is unsealed, you should just toss it anyway. Botulism is one of the things that scares people the most when it comes to home canning, and it's not something you should live in fear of. When I did a few years ago, I did a video specifically on this and did some research of what's the actual cases of botulism, and I was surprised to find that the amount of cases of people actually contracting botulism from home canned foods is very rare. In fact, I believe it was on the bottom of the list. You're more likely to get botulism or E. coli or salmonella from foods that you purchase from the store, whether they be fresh foods or packaged foods or even canned foods. That is more likely to happen. And the chances of dying from botulism are even more low. Yes, you can get very, very sick from it, but your chances of dying are even lower than getting it from your home canned foods. especially if you are practicing these safe measures when it comes to canning. So don't not start canning your food simply because you're afraid of botulism, because there's so much fear mongering done on that. Just learn the proper and safe methods for canning and you'll be fine. And if your jars lose a seal and you know it's lost a seal, then toss it. If you see mold or anything growing in the jar, then toss it. If your food in the jars has been sitting on the shelf for quite a few years and you notice the color is different, that just means the color has faded due to light exposure. That's to be expected. So don't let that freak you out either. Now let's just talk real quickly before I close out this video on a couple more things you should probably have on hand, and that would be a jar lifter. But if you don't have a jar lifter and you have a set of gloves or of Vin gloves, whichever brand you get, these can work really good for getting your jars out. These are especially helpful when you're doing the Tatler lids. So, and you're wanting to, let's say, in this case here, you pulled the jar out of the canner and you want to tighten down those bands. Having a set of gloves like this is really great, because then because you're going to do this while it's hot. You just tighten it down like that. So you can use these for getting your jars out. Another useful thing if you're doing metal lids are having this little magnet, because a lot of times if you're heating up your lids and you're putting them on there, you don't want to reach into the hot water. I like to leave my lids when I'm doing that process. If I'm canning anything hot, then I want my lids hot when they go on the jar. If I'm using metal lids, then I have the metal lids in the pan with the hot water, and then you can use the magnet. Obviously though, this isn't going to work on your Tatler lids because they're plastic and not metal. That's just a little added thing, not super necessary. You can always dump the water out of your pan and just use your fingers. That's mostly what I do anyway, especially since I'm almost always using Tatler lids. Now, I'm hoping I covered everything I meant to cover in this particular video, but if you have any more questions that I can either link you back to a video where I answer those questions or maybe do another video answering those questions, just go ahead and put them down below. I'm always happy to have new ideas to add to my FAQ series of videos that can help people out who have those common questions. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this video and it gives you some ideas of where to get started. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.